In last video, we have discussed that the sexual mode of reproduction in case of flowering plant take place in three main steps. The first one is pre-fertilizer event, fertilizer event and post-fertilizer event. In case of pre-fertilizer event, we discussed that it includes gametogenesis and gamete transfer. Gametogenesis already we have completed in the last video where we have discussed how microsporogenesis takes place in case of anther and how the formation of megaspore takes place. So megasporogenesis, which occurs in the pistil part of the flower. Now, after the formation of the microspore and megaspore, the next step is the transfer of the gametes so that both the gametes will fuse together and lead to the formation of the zygote. But in case of plants, we have discussed that the gametes which are formed, they are immotile. Hence, they need a medium or the way by which the transfer of the gamete takes place. So today we will discuss the method of the gamete transfer. As we have discussed that in case of plants, higher plants, angiospermic plants, the gametes are immotile. So they have to depend on some process or the methods so that the male gamete reaches to the site where the female gamete is there for the process of fertilization. So the process of the transfer of the gamete in case of plants that we are going to discuss is pollination. Now, in simple word, we can say the pollination is the transfer of the male gamete from the anther to the stigma of the female reproductive part. Hence, this method is known as pollination. Now, on the basis of the type of the pollination that takes place, we can say that the pollination can be of two types. What we have discussed on the basis of how the pollination takes place. So the pollination may be of two types. The two types of the pollination are, the number one is self-pollination and the second type is cross-pollination. Already we have discussed what happened during pollination. There have to be transfer of the male gamete from the anther to the stigma of the pistil. Here, if the transfer of the male gamete takes place within the from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or of the two flowers of the same plant, then that type of pollination is known as self-pollination. Whereas, if the transfer of the pollen grain takes place from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of different plant but of same species, then that is known as cross-pollination. So here we have discussed the transfer of the male gamete or the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same plant. Now, this self-pollination can further be classified into two types. Number one is autogamy and the second type is geitonogamy. Autogamy is the type of the pollination which occurs in case of the flower where the transfer of the pollen grains takes place from the anther of the same flower to the stigma of the same flower. So that type of pollination is known as autogamy. Here the transfer of the pollen grains occurs between the anther and the stigma of the same flower of the same plant. So that type of pollination is known as autogamy. The best example is P. oxalis, etc. Whereas if the transfer of the pollen grain takes place from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, then that type of pollination is known as geitonogamy. Here the example is cucurbits. So what we have discussed here, the pollen grains are being transferred from the anther of the same flower to the stigma of same flower. So the anther and the stigma remains. That means this type of flowers, they are bisexual. These type of flowers are bisexual flowers. But in case of this, in case of geitonogamy, what we have discussed, that the transfer of the pollen grain takes place from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but both the flowers remains on the same plant. So this type of pollination is known as geitongamous type of pollination. Next important point is, here we have to discuss that the flowers are mainly of two types. So the flowers are of two types. So we have to discuss the two types of the flower. The first one is cleistogamous flower, and the second type is chasmogamous flower. Chasmogamous flower. Cleistogamous flowers are those flowers which remain close so that the anther and the stigma never exposed. These are the flowers where both the reproductive parts are present in the same flower and the petal closes the reproductive part. Hence, there is no chance of the transfer of pollen grain from one flower to another flower. This type of flower, it always leads to the type of the pollination which is known as the self-pollination. But the chasmogamous type of the flowers are those flowers whose reproductive parts or the anther or the pistil, they are exposed, and hence there is a chance of the transfer of the pollen grain from one flower to the another flower. The third type of the pollination is known as cross-pollination. This pollination is also known as xenogamy. So, this type of pollination is known as xenogamy or allogamy Xenogamy or cross-pollination is the type of the pollination where the transfer of pollen grain takes place from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of same species. So here as the pollen grains have to be transferred from the one flower of a plant to the another flower of another plant. That's why they need the help of some pollinating agencies. They are happening with the help of pollinating agencies, or which are known as pollinators. These pollinators or the pollinating agencies can be of two types. They may be abiotic pollinators or they may be biotic pollinators. So, cross-pollination is depending on the external pollinating agent, which may be abiotic or biotic pollinators. Abiotic pollination takes place with the help of wind, water, whereas the biotic pollinators, which help in the process of cross-pollination, they may be the animals, insects, birds, bats, etc. So, a number of pollinators are there which help in this case. The type of the pollination which takes place with the help of the wind is known as anemophily. Anemo means wind and phyllis means pollination. Whereas if the pollination takes place with the help of water, it is known as hydrophily. Similarly, if the pollination takes place with the help of animals, then it is known as zoophily. If the pollination takes place with the help of insects, then it is known as entomophily. If it takes place with the help of insects. If the pollination takes place with the help of birds, then it is known as ornithophily. Similarly, if the pollination takes place with the help of bat, then it is known as Chiroptophily. So here we have discussed that the pollination can be basically of two types, self and cross-pollination. In case of self-pollination, as the transfer of the pollen grain takes place from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower of the same flower, or it may be the two flowers of the same plant, hence it is known as self-pollination. The advantage of this type of self-pollination is, as the parental flowers are genetically similar, hence the seeds which are formed, they are also genetically same. This is one of the advantages, but the disadvantage of this type of pollination is it leads to inbreeding depression. Inbreeding depression. That we have to discuss later on. Whereas in case of cross-pollination, we have discussed that the transfer of the pollen grain have to be taken place from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the different plants. Hence, the parental plants, they are not genetically similar, because of which the seeds which are formed, they are also not genetically similar, and it leads to variation which helps them to overcome or adapt themselves according to the changing environment. So this is the advantage of cross-pollination. In case of cross-pollination, the number of the pollen grains have to be produced in very large amount, because they have to depend on the pollinating agencies. Whereas in this case, the number of the gametes which are being produced is comparatively lesser. Now, in the next video, so hence we have seen that how the gamete transfer takes place in case of angiospermic plants. In the next video, we will discuss the important features of the flowers which are pollinating by the different agencies and the adaptation which takes place in that type of flower. Thank you.